The calm before the storm, the hum of the Boeing 787 Dreamliner was almost like a lullaby, steady and soothing, blending with the faint chatter of passengers settling into their seats. The glow of the early evening sun painted streaks of gold across the clouds outside, casting warm light through the oversized windows of the first-class cabin. Elijah Carter leaned back into the deep leather seat, the cushion embracing him like an armchair in a private study, and exhaled with the quiet satisfaction of someone stepping into a moment he would remember for the rest of his life. He turned slightly toward his twin sister, Olivia, who sat beside him, her delicate fingers turning the pages of a small leather-bound journal. She looked calm, composed, as though she had been flying first class for years. Yet Elijah could see the flicker of excitement dancing in her eyes. She was trying to appear mature, trying to honor their father's trust, but he could read her every expression as if it were written in the air between them. It was their first time traveling without parental supervision, their first time navigating the real world with no protective barrier. Their father, Michael Carter, the globally recognized CEO of the technological empire known as Global Tech, had arranged this journey not as an indulgence but as a lesson, a quiet milestone to test the resilience and independence of his children. For years he had raised them with the conviction that dignity was not something anyone could give or take. It was a birthright, a responsibility, something that resided in how one carried themselves even in the harshest situations. He often said that the true test of character was not how one behaved when everything went right, but how one responded when the world pushed against them. Now, at 15, Elijah and Olivia were being given a stage to prove that they had inherited that creed. The two most coveted seats on the plane, 1A and 1B, had been reserved specifically for them. Michael had called the airline personally, ensuring that every detail of their trip was arranged with care. He wanted the journey to symbolize something far greater than a flight. It was a gesture of faith, a way of saying that his children were ready to stand on their own. Elijah adjusted the seatbelt across his lap, feeling the firmness of the polished buckle, and smiled faintly as he looked out the window. Below him, the ground was already shrinking, the runways like lines drawn with a ruler, the tiny airport vehicles scurrying like insects. Above him, the sky stretched endlessly, deepening into a canvas of fading sunlight. Olivia closed her journal and placed it gently on the small table between them. Her voice, soft and thoughtful, broke the silence. "Do you think Dad will be proud of us when we get back?" she asked, turning her gaze toward her brother with a mixture of anticipation and quiet nerves. Elijah's lips curved into a confident smile. "He already is. That's why he gave us this trip. He trusts us, Olivia. He believes we can handle whatever comes our way." He reached over and tapped her hand gently, a subtle reassurance that he always offered when she doubted herself. Their bond was unspoken yet unbreakable. Since childhood, they had moved like two halves of the same soul. When one faltered, the other carried the strength for both. A flight attendant in a crisp blue uniform approached, her professional smile warm and respectful. "Mr. and Miss Carter, may I offer you something to drink before we take off?" she asked politely, her tone carrying the formal recognition that made the twins feel both nervous and honored. Elijah glanced at his sister before answering, his voice steady and calm. "Orange juice for both of us, please." The attendant nodded and disappeared down the aisle, leaving them in a bubble of quiet anticipation. Olivia chuckled softly, leaning closer to her brother. "They called us Mr. and Miss Carter. Did you hear that? I think this is the first time anyone's spoken to us the way they speak to Dad." Elijah grinned. "Get used to it. That's how the world will see us from now on, not just as kids but as people who carry responsibility, people who matter." For a few moments their world was perfect. The cabin smelled faintly of leather and perfume. The ambient light dimmed to create a sense of intimacy, and the clinking of glasses and the rustle of newspapers created an elegant soundtrack. It felt like the kind of journey their father had always envisioned for them, smooth, dignified, free of complications. But beneath that polished serenity, the stage was already being set for the storm that would test every word their father had ever taught them. The sound of measured, confident footsteps echoed from the entrance of the cabin. A woman, elegantly dressed in a beige coat, walked in with the air of someone accustomed to being obeyed rather than accommodated. Her chin lifted slightly, her sharp eyes scanning the seats with the precision of a general surveying a battlefield. Karen Mitchell was her name, a platinum elite customer of Skyline Airways, a woman whose reputation among staff preceded her. She had been flying for over 2 decades, and in her mind, certain seats belonged to her as surely as property titles belonged to a landowner. She did not see them as tickets, subject to change, but as possessions secured by years of loyalty and money. And the moment her eyes fell on the twins seated comfortably in 1A and 1B, her expression hardened. Her steps grew more pointed as she approached. Other passengers turned their heads slightly, sensing the disturbance in her aura, though none said a word. Elijah noticed her first, his instincts sharp, and leaned subtly toward Olivia. "Stay calm," he whispered. Olivia's eyes followed his gaze, narrowing when she saw the woman heading straight for them. Her lips pressed tight in a thin line of disapproval. Karen stopped in front of them, her shadow falling across their seats, and addressed them without so much as a greeting. Her voice was clipped, cold, and loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "There seems to be a mistake. These seats 1A and 1B are mine. They always have been." She paused, crossing her arms as though waiting for them to rise immediately, her tone dripping with entitlement. Olivia glanced at her brother, her brow furrowing. Elijah, maintaining his composure, spoke politely. "I believe these seats are ours, ma'am." They were booked in advance. The tension thickened instantly. The flight attendant returned at that moment, balancing a tray with 2 glasses of orange juice. She stopped, startled by the icy confrontation unfolding before her. Setting the glasses down quickly, she tried to mediate. "Miss Mitchell, we've confirmed that these seats are reserved for Elijah and Olivia Carter. Their father arranged everything personally." Karen's face darkened, her sharp features hardening further. "Carter? That name means nothing to me. Do you know who I am? I am Skyline's most loyal Platinum Elite member. For years, these seats have been mine. I will not sit anywhere else." She turned her gaze back to the twins, her eyes cold and dismissive. "Children do not belong in these seats. Not when I am here." The words hung in the air like a dagger, cutting into the fragile peace of the cabin. Passengers shifted in their seats, some pretending not to listen while others leaned ever so slightly closer, drawn by the unfolding drama. Elijah's hands rested calmly on his lap, his shoulders squared. Olivia sat taller, her eyes steady, though her heart raced beneath the surface. This was the test. This was the moment their father had prepared them for, though neither had expected it so soon or in this form. It was not a simple matter of seats. It was about dignity, about being told they did not belong, about standing their ground when it would have been easier to shrink into silence. Elijah inhaled slowly, his voice calm but firm. "With all due respect, ma'am, we are sitting in our rightful seats. Our tickets confirm it. If there is an issue, perhaps you should speak with the airline staff, not with us." Karen's lips curled into a thin, humorless smile, the kind that revealed not amusement but condescension. "Do you have any idea how much money I have spent with this airline? Do you know the weight my name carries here? These seats are mine, and I will not be moved by 2 children who think they are entitled because of their father's money." Her words were loud, deliberately so, meant to pierce the air and sway the silent witnesses around them. The twins could feel the unspoken judgment of strangers pressing on them like a heavy blanket. Yet they remained still, unyielding, their silence more powerful than an outburst could ever be. For a brief moment, time seemed to slow. The cabin was a stage, the audience silent, the tension unbroken. And in the center of it all, 2 15-year-old twins sat with dignity, refusing to yield what was rightfully theirs. It was only the beginning of the storm. Voices raised, silence broken. The quiet authority of Elijah's words had been intended to bring closure to the rising tension, yet instead it only seemed to fuel Karen Mitchell's indignation. The air within the first-class cabin grew heavy, as if every molecule had absorbed the hostility radiating from her presence. Passengers sitting a row away leaned discreetly toward the aisle, ears tilted like antennas, listening with a mixture of curiosity and unease. It was not every day that entitlement dressed itself so brazenly and confronted 2 children who had done nothing wrong, but sit where they rightfully belonged. Karen's chin tilted upward, her posture rigid as if the seat dispute were not about comfort but about power, about preserving her sense of superiority. Her voice rose another notch, sharp enough to cut through the ambient noise of the plane. "This is not about tickets," she declared, her eyes darting between the twins with visible disdain. This is about respect, about recognizing who truly belongs in these seats. You children may have been pampered by your father, but you cannot expect the world to bow to you just because of a last name. Olivia's hands tightened on the armrests, her knuckles paling, yet she did not flinch. She had always been the quieter of the two, more comfortable with books and thoughts than with open confrontation. But now, as Karen's words dripped with venom and prejudice, something inside her shifted. She lifted her head with a calm, steady resolve that belied her age, and her voice, though soft, carried with it the weight of truth. Respect is not demanded, ma'am. It is given freely when it is deserved. Right now you are asking us to give up what is ours simply because you believe your years of flying make you more important. But they do not. Our father did not buy us dignity, he taught us to carry it. And nothing you say will make us surrender it. The words were not loud, yet they echoed in the silence that followed. For a fleeting second, even Karen seemed struck by the composure of a 15-year-old girl who spoke with more grace than many adults she had encountered. Her lips parted as if to retort, but the faint shift in the cabin around her gave her pause. A few passengers had lowered their newspapers, some had removed their headphones, and others were exchanging subtle glances as if silently acknowledging that the balance of the argument had tipped. Karen's face flushed with a mixture of anger and humiliation. For someone who had lived her life commanding attention and obedience, being defied not by executives, not by seasoned travelers, but by two black teenagers, felt intolerable. She snapped her gaze toward the flight attendant, Megan, who had been hovering nervously at the edge of the confrontation. "Are you really going to stand there and allow this nonsense? I demand that you move them. Right now. If you do not, I assure you your job will not last beyond this flight." Megan faltered, her lips parting, but no sound emerged. She had been trained to de-escalate situations, to soothe egos with practiced diplomacy, but nothing in her manual had prepared her for the raw arrogance of a passenger, demanding the removal of rightful ticket holders. Her eyes darted helplessly toward the rear of the cabin where the supervisor had yet to arrive. Her silence was a confession. She was torn between the rules that bound her and the fear that disobedience to a platinum member might end her career. Elijah leaned forward, his elbows resting lightly on his knees, his voice steady and measured. "Miss, you are putting this young woman in an impossible position. She is only doing her job. If you truly believe there has been a mistake, then wait for the supervisor. But do not insult us and do not threaten her livelihood." The poise with which he spoke contrasted sharply with Karen's rising hysteria, and the comparison was not lost on the bystanders. A man seated 2 rows behind wearing a navy business suit lowered his gaze with an almost imperceptible shake of his head. A mother traveling with her child pulled her son closer, whispering something into his ear that made his eyes widen with curiosity. The silent witnesses were no longer detached. They were recording, memorizing, and silently judging. Karen's laugh was short and bitter, the kind that did not convey amusement, but pure disbelief. "Listen to this," she said loudly, sweeping her arm toward the other passengers as if inviting them into her performance. "2 children lecturing me about jobs, about respect. Do you see what kind of arrogance money breeds? Do you see what happens when children are raised to believe they are untouchable?" Her voice carried through the cabin, forcing everyone into the uncomfortable position of spectators unwillingly dragged into a theater of pride and prejudice. Elijah did not respond immediately. He turned slightly toward his sister, and in that shared glance both drew strength from one another. For all their differences, they understood that silence, too, could be an act of defiance. That dignity was sometimes more powerful when left unspoken. Olivia rested her back against the seat, folding her hands in her lap, with the composure of royalty on a throne. Her eyes, however, never left Karen's face. The calm refusal in her expression infuriated the woman more than words could. It was as if the twins were telling her, without a single syllable, that she no longer held power in this battle. The moment was interrupted by the arrival of Laura Evans, the flight supervisor. She moved with the authority of experience, her uniform immaculate, her expression calm yet sharp enough to command attention. Her presence shifted the atmosphere, as though a referee had stepped into a ring. "What seems to be the issue here?" she asked, her tone even, her eyes scanning the scene with practiced precision. Karen immediately turned to her, her voice dripping with a mock sweetness she had not shown before. "Laura, thank goodness you are here. Finally, someone who understands. These seats, my seats, have been taken by these two children. I have been flying with this airline for over a decade. I have status, loyalty, proof of commitment. I cannot be treated this way." Laura's gaze shifted to the twins, studying them carefully. She noted their calm postures, their unflinching eyes, their refusal to shout or escalate. They sat with a dignity that spoke volumes, and for a moment, the supervisor felt a flicker of something unusual. Respect. She turned back to Karen, her voice measured. "Miss Mitchell, I understand your frustration, but according to our system, these seats were booked under the names Elijah and Olivia Carter. They have every right to be here." The words landed like a stone dropped into still water, rippling through the silence. Karen's face twisted, her composure unraveling further. "Are you saying you would rather side with two children than with a platinum elite member? Do you understand who I am? Do you understand how much I have given to this airline?" Laura remained unshaken. "I understand that every passenger, regardless of their history with this airline, is entitled to the seat they have paid for. Loyalty matters, yes, but rules matter more. And these children have tickets for these seats. That is not up for debate." The twins felt a wave of relief, subtle yet profound, though they did not allow it to show on their faces. Their father's lessons echoed silently within them. Never gloat, never mock, never meet arrogance with arrogance. Dignity was not about winning arguments. It was about standing firm without losing oneself. But Karen was not finished. Her voice dropped lower, colder, cutting through the cabin with deliberate cruelty. Children like them always think they are special. They think their names protect them. Their wealth shields them. Their skin excuses them. But let me remind you, the world does not bend for everyone. It bends only for those who prove their worth. And I do not see it here. The silence that followed was not the silence of indifference. It was the silence of shock. The silence of passengers realizing they had witnessed a line crossed. Some shifted uncomfortably. Others glanced away. But the weight of Karen's words hung heavy in the air like smoke after a fire. Elijah exhaled slowly, his voice calm but unwavering. "Ma'am, you are right about one thing. The world does not bend for everyone. It bends only for those who believe they can force others down. But our Father taught us differently. He taught us to stand, even when the world tries to bend us. We are not leaving these seats. Not because of money, not because of privilege, but because they are ours. And no amount of shouting will change that." Karen's mouth opened, but no words came. For the first time, she seemed rattled by the unyielding resolve of two children who refused to break under her pressure. She turned away sharply, muttering under her breath, her pride bruised yet unwilling to surrender completely. Laura stepped closer to the twins, her expression softening slightly. "You handled yourselves with grace," she said quietly, almost as though speaking only to them. Then, with a firmer voice directed at the cabin, she added, "This matter is settled. These seats belong to the Carters. We ask that all passengers respect the rights of others as we prepare for departure." The supervisor's words restored a measure of calm, but beneath the surface the fire still burned. Karen returned to her seat several rows back, her movement stiff with resentment. Her eyes, however, lingered on the twins, her thoughts simmering with unfinished anger. She was not done, and the twins could feel it. The storm had not passed. It had only shifted to a quieter, more dangerous phase. Elijah glanced at his sister, their eyes locking in unspoken agreement. They had faced the first wave, but they both knew the confrontation was far from over. Somewhere deep in their hearts, they could almost hear their father's voice, steady, reassuring, reminding them that dignity was not negotiable. And though they sat thousands of feet above the ground, they knew the weight of justice would soon descend. One phone call, one voice from their father could alter the course of this flight, of this airline, of every person involved. They had not yet picked up the phone, but the possibility shimmered in the air like a storm waiting to break. The calm before the second wave had arrived, and everyone in the first-class cabin knew they had just witnessed the opening act of a story that would not end quietly. The call that changed everything, the row. Flight had barely left the tarmac when the tension still lingered in the first-class cabin, like a stubborn shadow that refused to fade. Passengers who had once buried their faces in books or screens now sat with their bodies slightly turned, ears tuned to the undercurrent of hostility that still pulsed in the air. Although the supervisor's final words had declared the matter closed, everyone knew the confrontation was far from resolved. Karen Mitchell, seated only a few rows back, simmered with indignation, her jaw tight, her eyes fixed on the twins as though their very presence were an insult that gnawed at her pride. Elijah leaned back in his seat, feigning calm, but inside his thoughts churned. His father had told him countless times that silence could be stronger than argument, that dignity could outlast cruelty, but there was also another lesson his father had instilled. Never mistake silence for weakness. There was a time to endure, and a time to act. Elijah's hand brushed against the phone tucked inside his jacket pocket, the weight of it suddenly heavier than it had ever been. He looked at Olivia, and in that instant no words were needed. She understood what he was thinking because she was thinking it too. Karen had not spoken again, but her presence filled the cabin with a venomous energy. The way she shifted in her seat, the way she whispered to the attendant every time one passed, the sharp glances she shot toward the twins. It was all a performance meant to reclaim control, to remind the cabin that she would not accept defeat. Olivia sat upright, her book untouched on her lap, her eyes fixed ahead. She knew that reacting further would only feed Karen's theatrics, but she also knew this could not continue unchallenged. There was more at stake than 2 seats. There was the principle, the quiet but immovable truth that dignity was not for sale and not to be handed over because someone shouted louder. The moment of decision came when Karen rose abruptly from her seat and began pacing down the aisle as though she owned the plane itself. She stopped near the galley, her voice just loud enough to be overheard, speaking sharply to one of the attendants. "You do realize this is unacceptable, don't you? 2 children, taking my seats while I am pushed back like some tourist. Do you know who I am? Do you know the kind of calls I can make? I will not forget this insult. I assure you heads will roll by the time we land." The words, deliberately projected, spread like ripples through the cabin. A few passengers shook their heads, some rolled their eyes, but the sting of her contempt was undeniable. Elijah inhaled deeply, his patience stretched thin. He reached into his jacket, pulling out the phone with steady hands. Olivia turned to him, her eyes wide but not fearful, only resolute. "Are you sure?" she whispered. He nodded. "Dad always said we would know when the time was right. This is it." He pressed the familiar number, the one etched into his mind not merely as a contact but as a lifeline. The phone rang once, twice, and then a deep, steady voice filled his ear. Elijah. The sound of his father's voice carried a weight that immediately steadied him, a voice that commanded boardrooms, governments, and entire industries, but to Elijah, it was simply the voice that had guided him through every uncertainty. "Dad," he said softly, his words careful, respectful, "we're on the flight. There's a problem." Michael Carter listened in silence as his son explained, his tone never wavering, his account precise. He described how Karen Mitchell had confronted them, demanded their seats, demeaned them publicly, and continued to create hostility even after the supervisor had settled the matter. Olivia leaned closer, adding quietly but firmly, "She's still trying to intimidate us, Dad. She will not stop." We tried to stay calm, but it is not enough. There was a pause on the other end of the line, but it was not the pause of hesitation. It was the pause of calculation, of quiet fury masked by composure. When Michael spoke again, his words were low, deliberate, and steady. "You did well. You did exactly what I raised you to do. You stood your ground. You kept your dignity. Now it is my turn." Elijah exhaled, relief mingled with the weight of what he knew was coming. Michael Carter was not a man who raised his voice often, but when he acted, entire systems shifted. He was not only a father, he was a force that entire corporations and industries recognized. Olivia placed her hand gently over Elijah's, her eyes reflecting both pride and anticipation. They had held their ground, but now their father would ensure that the insult did not go unanswered. Michael's voice hardened slightly, a tone that Elijah recognized from stories told by board members who had witnessed his father dismantle arrogance with nothing but truth. "Stay seated. Do not move. Do not give her the satisfaction. From this moment forward, you will not lift a finger. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," Elijah replied quietly, his chest tightening with both reverence and relief. "Good," Michael said. "Now let me take care of the rest." When the call ended, Elijah slipped the phone back into his pocket, his face composed, though his heart raced. Olivia leaned in, whispering, "What did he say?" Elijah's lips curved into a faint smile. He said to stay still. "That's all we need to do." Olivia nodded, her faith unwavering. She trusted their father, not merely because of his power but because of his principles. He had never let injustice pass unchecked, whether it was in business or in life. He believed that silence, when abused by those in power, was complicity. And she knew that if Michael Carter had decided to act, then Karen Mitchell's arrogance had just signed its own downfall. Meanwhile, Karen had returned to her seat, her arms folded, her lips pressed into a thin smile of self-satisfaction. In her mind, she had won already. She believed the attendants feared her, that the airline valued her above all, and that 2 children could never outlast the influence of someone like her. But she did not know whose children she had chosen to confront. She did not know that the name Carter was not just a name. It was a legacy, a storm waiting to be unleashed. Passengers noticed the subtle change in the twins. They sat calmer now, more resolute, as though they knew something the rest of the cabin did not. It was not arrogance that settled over them, but certainty, a quiet assurance that came from trust in a father whose presence could shake the ground even when he was not physically there. The minutes stretched on, the hum of the engines filling the silence. Attendants busied themselves with preparing for the meal service, but their eyes occasionally flicked toward the twins, toward Karen, toward the invisible line drawn between dignity and entitlement. The plane soared higher into the night sky, but within the cabin, the stage was being set for something greater than a simple seat dispute. Elijah closed his eyes briefly, hearing his father's words echoing in his mind. Stay seated. Do not move. Do not give her the satisfaction. The simplicity of the command carried within it the strength of generations, the calm before an inevitable reckoning. Olivia opened her journal again, her pen moving slowly across the page, as though recording not only her thoughts but the memory of a night she already knew would become a story, retold for years. Karen Mitchell reclined in her seat, confident that her grievances would soon tip the scales in her favor. But she did not yet realize that a phone call had already shifted the balance. At 30,000 feet, in a cabin suspended between clouds and stars, the truth was about to descend with the weight of inevitability. The children had done their part. Now justice was in motion. The sky begins to shift. The plane had reached its cruising altitude, the cabin lights dimmed to a gentle glow, and the flight attendants moved quietly through the aisles, preparing trays for dinner service. To an outside observer, everything seemed serene, but within the boundaries of the first-class cabin, the air was still charged with an invisible storm. Karen Mitchell sat in her seat with her arms crossed and her chin raised, her expression one of cold triumph. She believed she had asserted herself, believed that her reputation and loyalty to the airline placed her above reproach. Her lips curled into a smug smile each time she caught the flight attendant's eyes, convinced that fear had secured her dominance. Yet while Karen reveled in her illusion of control, subtle shifts were already underway. Michael Carter had ended his call with his children and immediately dialed a private line known to only a handful of people, the direct executive contact to Skyline Airways headquarters. On the other end, the CEO of the airline, a man named Charles Whitmore, answered without hesitation. Michael's voice was steady, calm, but beneath the surface was a current of steel. He recounted every detail his children had shared, his tone sharp with precision, each word measured and deliberate. By the time he finished, Whitmore was silent for a moment. Not out of doubt, but out of the heavy realization that his airline had just crossed the wrong man. Michael, Whitmore finally said, his voice carrying a nervous edge, I assure you this will be handled immediately. No passenger, regardless of status, has the right to demean or intimidate another, and certainly not your children. Michael's reply was quiet, almost colder because of its restraint. This is not about my children alone. This is about the principles your airline claims to uphold. Respect, safety, equality. If one passenger can weaponize privilege against 2 children and the staff hesitate out of fear, then your systems are broken. I will not tolerate it. Fix this before I land. Whitmore swallowed hard, nodding even though Michael could not see him. Consider it done. Within minutes, the ripple began to spread from headquarters down to the flight crew mid-air. A discreet message flashed across the cockpit screen, routed to the flight supervisor, Laura Evans. She glanced at the note, her brow tightening, her pulse quickening. The message was short but unmistakable. The Carter children are to be treated with utmost respect. Any passenger harassing them is to be reported immediately. Do not compromise. Headquarters is monitoring. Laura exhaled quietly. She had already sensed the gravity of the situation when she first saw Elijah and Olivia's composure. Now she understood why their bearing seemed older than their years. They were not ordinary children. They were the heirs to a man whose influence extended into the very system she served. Straightening her uniform, she made her way down the aisle, her steps precise, her face a mask of calm authority. Karen noticed her approach and smirked as though victory were imminent. She leaned slightly forward, ready to bask in the apology she believed was due to her, but the words that came from Laura's mouth froze the satisfaction on her lips. "Miss Mitchell," Laura began, her tone respectful but firm, "I must inform you that your behavior toward the Carter children has been deemed unacceptable. We will not tolerate further disruption or disrespect toward any passenger on this flight. You are expected to remain in your assigned seat for the duration of the journey. Any further escalation will result in formal reports filed directly with headquarters." The words landed like thunder, shattering the illusion Karen had carefully built. Her eyes widened in disbelief, her lips parting in shock. "Excuse me? Unacceptable? Do you have any idea who you are speaking to? I am a platinum elite. I have sat in these seats for years. And you are threatening me?" Laura did not flinch. "I am not threatening you, Miss Mitchell. I am stating the rules. Loyalty status does not excuse harassment. The seats occupied by Mr. Elijah Carter and Miss Olivia Carter are theirs by right. This matter is closed." Karen's face flushed crimson, her composure unraveling before the eyes of the silent audience that had grown in number. Passengers who had tried to pretend disinterest were now openly watching, some with faint smiles of satisfaction, others with quiet nods of approval. For the first time, the balance of power had shifted visibly. Elijah and Olivia sat motionless, their posture regal in its restraint. They did not smile, did not exchange triumphant glances, did not gloat. They sat as their father had instructed, calm, dignified, unmoved. But inside, Olivia felt a rush of vindication, a warmth that spread through her chest. It was not joy at Karen's humiliation, but relief that justice for once had spoken in real time. Elijah too felt the weight of the moment. He had always known his father's reach was wide, but witnessing it unfold mid-air was something different entirely. It was as though the invisible hand of justice had descended through the clouds to remind them that dignity could not be stolen. Karen, however, was not ready to surrender. Her voice cracked slightly as she rose to her feet, her movements stiff with indignation. "This is outrageous. You cannot treat me this way. Do you have any idea the calls I can make? Do you have any idea the damage I can do?" Laura's eyes hardened. "I suggest you sit down, Miss Mitchell. For your own sake." The silence that followed was heavier than anything before. Passengers leaned back in their seats, waiting. Karen's fists clenched at her sides, her nails digging into her palms, but even she knew the line had been drawn. Slowly, reluctantly, she sank back into her seat, her shoulders rigid, her lips trembling with restrained fury. Olivia lowered her gaze briefly to the journal on her lap, her pen hovering above the page. She wanted to capture this moment, the way arrogance had collapsed under the weight of truth, the way silence had become their strongest weapon. She wrote a single line, her handwriting calm and deliberate. "Dignity cannot be demanded. It must be lived." Elijah's eyes remained on the horizon outside, the endless darkness of the sky punctuated by stars. He thought of his father, of the lessons that had shaped him, of the call that had carried more weight than any argument he could have made. His father's presence was not here physically, but it was everywhere in this cabin now, pressing down with invisible authority, commanding respect without a single raised voice. Karen sat in silence, her pride fractured, her confidence shaken. She did not know yet that this was only the beginning of the consequences. Headquarters had already begun compiling reports, cross-checking her history of complaints, tallying the countless times her entitlement had driven staff to the brink. What she believed was loyalty the airline cherished was being revealed for what it truly was, a pattern of abuse. By the time this flight landed, her platinum status would no longer be a shield. For now, though, the cabin settled into a tentative calm. The meal service resumed, passengers unfolded their trays, and the soft clink of cutlery returned. But beneath the polished surface, the lesson lingered, etched into every heart that had witnessed it. Arrogance might demand the world to bend, but dignity had the power to hold it firm, and Elijah and Olivia, sitting side by side in seats 1A and 1B, understood now more than ever that their father's lessons were not abstract ideals, but living truths. They had been tested and they had endured. The storm was not over yet, but the sky had begun to shift. The weight of landing, the long hours of the transatlantic flight slowly unraveled under the steady rhythm of the engines. But the atmosphere in the first-class cabin never returned fully to normal. The passengers ate their meals, reclined in their wide leather seats, and engaged in hushed conversations, but every so often, eyes would wander toward the twins in 1A and 1B. They were no longer seen simply as children enjoying their father's gift of first-class travel. They had become symbols of quiet resilience, young figures who had refused to bend under the weight of arrogance. Even those who had remained silent during the confrontation could not deny what they had witnessed. The dignity of two teenagers shaming the arrogance of someone who believed herself untouchable. Karen Mitchell sat several rows back. Her expression hardened into a mask of resentment. She had spoken little after her confrontation with the supervisor, but her silence was not peace. It was the smoldering silence of pride that had been fractured, of a woman who believed the world owed her obedience and could not yet comprehend how she had been denied. She stared out the window with cold eyes, occasionally muttering to herself, her body rigid against the seat. The attendants avoided her when possible, their steps brisk, their service minimal but polite. Where once they had bowed to her demands out of fear of her influence, now they served her only because duty required it. The balance of power had shifted. Elijah sat back in his seat, his gaze fixed on the endless night outside the window. The stars stretched across the darkness, a reminder of how small even the loudest voices were in the face of the universe. He thought of his father's voice, steady and commanding over the phone, instructing them to remain still, to hold their dignity as tightly as they held their seats. His father had always told him that leadership was not about noise or threats, but about presence, the kind of presence that could bend storms without lifting a finger. Tonight, Elijah had seen that truth made real. Beside him, Olivia opened her journal again, her handwriting neat and deliberate as she recorded her reflections. She did not write about Karen Mitchell directly. She wrote about what the moment had revealed. She wrote about how silence could speak louder than shouting, how justice did not need to announce itself to be powerful, and how dignity, once compromised, could never be bought back with apologies. Her words flowed steadily, not for others to read but for herself, so she would never forget what it felt like to stand tall when someone tried to diminish her. Hours passed, and eventually the announcement came from the captain. The plane began its descent, the city lights sparkling below like scattered diamonds across the earth. Passengers straightened in their seats, fastening their belts, gathering their belongings, preparing for arrival. Yet the true landing had already happened, long before the wheels touched the runway. Justice had already descended into the cabin, quietly but unmistakably. When the plane rolled to a stop and the seatbelt sign clicked off, the first-class passengers rose in an unhurried wave. Attendants opened the overhead compartments, helping with bags, while others stood in the aisles waiting to disembark. Karen Mitchell remained seated, her expression sour, her movements stiff. She seemed unwilling to rise, as though delaying the inevitable moment when she would have to walk past the twins she had tried so hard to displace. The supervisor, Laura Evans, approached the Carter children with a quiet smile. "Mr. and Miss Carter, thank you for your patience this evening. Your composure has been remarkable. Your father will be proud." Her words were soft, but carried the sincerity of someone who had witnessed something rare. Elijah inclined his head respectfully, offering no boast, only a simple acknowledgement. Olivia returned the smile, her calm eyes reflecting gratitude. As the passengers began to exit, a group of uniformed airline representatives stood waiting just beyond the jet bridge. They wore the unmistakable look of authority, managers dispatched by headquarters to ensure the matter did not go unresolved. Their presence alone told the story. The Carter name had been heard, and justice had been summoned. Karen Mitchell finally stood, her designer bag clutched tightly against her arm. She walked stiffly down the aisle, her eyes forward, refusing to glance at the twins. But as she stepped into the jet bridge, she was intercepted by one of the managers, a tall man with a badge clipped to his suit. His voice was calm, almost courteous, but it carried no room for negotiation. "Miss Mitchell, you will need to step aside with us." We have matters to discuss regarding your conduct on this flight. Karen froze, her face draining of color. Passengers streamed past her, some pausing briefly, their eyes widening as realization dawned. She stammered, "This is ridiculous. I am a platinum elite. I should not." The manager's voice remained steady. "Status does not excuse misconduct. You will need to come with us." Her protests echoed briefly, but they fell flat against the measured authority of the airline staff. Slowly, reluctantly, she was guided away, her figure shrinking against the wide corridor, her arrogance collapsing under the quiet weight of accountability. For the first time in years, Karen Mitchell's name and privilege could not shield her. Meanwhile, Elijah and Olivia stepped off the plane together, their heads held high, their steps steady. They were met by a representative who bowed slightly and said, "Mr. and Miss Carter, your father asked us to extend his regards. Transportation has been arranged for you outside. We apologize deeply for the experience you endured." Elijah gave a polite nod. "Thank you. We appreciate it." Olivia smiled faintly, her hand resting on the strap of her small carry-on bag. "No apology is necessary. We learned what our father wanted us to learn." The representative blinked, slightly puzzled but did not question further. Outside, the cool night air embraced them as they descended the stairs into the waiting black sedan. The city skyline glittered in the distance, the hum of traffic a reminder that the world continued on, vast and indifferent. Yet for the twins, something had shifted inside them. They had faced arrogance that tried to strip them of their dignity, and they had emerged unshaken. They had seen their father's principles tested and proven. As the car pulled away, Olivia leaned her head against the window, her journal resting on her lap. "Do you think Dad will ask us what happened?" she murmured. Elijah's gaze remained forward, his voice steady. "He already knows. But when he does ask, I'll tell him the truth. We didn't move. We stayed where we belonged." Olivia closed her eyes, the faintest smile touching her lips. She whispered almost to herself, "Dignity is not up for negotiation." The car drove on, the lights of the city blurring into streaks of gold. Somewhere in the quiet of the night, Michael Carter sat in his office, his phone on the desk, his expression calm but resolute. He had not raised his voice, he had not issued threats, yet his influence had spoken louder than arrogance ever could. His children had learned the lesson he had always wanted them to carry, that true power was not in demanding obedience, but in holding fast to dignity, even when the world tried to strip it away. And so the story ended not with shouting, nor with triumph flaunted, but with quiet truth. Justice had prevailed, arrogance had been humbled, and two children had stepped further into the path of maturity. Their father's legacy imprinted not in wealth or status, but in the unshakable truth that some things cannot be bought, cannot be stolen, cannot be denied. Among those, the greatest was dignity.